Imagine waking up in a world where nobody knows a single word. No food, no danger, no names, no stories, no language at all. If you wanted to warn someone about a predator hiding in the trees, you couldn't shout its name. If you wanted to tell your family where you had found food yesterday, you had no words to describe the place. Even explaining something as simple as "follow me" would be almost impossible. Yet somehow, over thousands of years, those silent beginnings eventually led to every language spoken on Earth today. So how did ancient humans learn to talk? At first, the question seems impossible to answer. After all, language doesn't leave fossils behind. Archaeologists can discover ancient tools, weapons, campfires, and even footprints, but they cannot dig up the first conversation. Nobody knows exactly what the earliest spoken words sounded like, or even when humans first became capable of using them. But while we may never hear those first voices, science has given us enough clues to build a surprisingly clear picture of how language may have slowly emerged. The first thing to understand is that language almost certainly wasn't invented by one brilliant person. There was no prehistoric genius who suddenly woke up one morning and decided that a certain sound would mean water, while another would mean fire. Language wasn't a single invention. It was a process that unfolded over countless generations, so slowly that no individual would have realized they were part of it. Long before humans had proper words, our ancestors were already communicating. Even today, animals communicate in remarkable ways. Wolves use body language to coordinate with their pack. Birds have different calls for different types of danger. Chimpanzees use facial expressions, gestures, and dozens of vocal sounds to express emotions, warn each other, or strengthen social bonds. Early humans almost certainly did something similar. Imagine standing beside another member of your group. You point toward a fruit tree. You wave your hand for them to follow. You smile when they understand. You frown when something is dangerous. Without speaking a single word, you've already communicated several ideas. In many situations, gestures alone can be surprisingly effective. Even today, people who don't share a language often manage to communicate using little more than pointing, facial expressions, and simple movements. Our ancestors probably relied on these abilities constantly, but gestures have one major limitation. They only work when everyone can see each other. Imagine carrying heavy firewood through a forest. Your friend walks several meters ahead. Suddenly you notice a predator hidden in the bushes. Pointing won't help. By the time they turn around to look, it could already be too late. A sound, however, can travel through darkness, around obstacles, and over long distances. This may be one reason why vocal communication became so important. Early human sounds probably didn't resemble modern speech. They were likely simple calls expressing basic ideas or emotions. A particular sound might have meant "come here," while another warned of immediate danger. Different sounds may have signaled excitement, fear, food, or the presence of strangers. At first, these sounds were probably very limited, but every generation learned from the one before it. Children copied the sounds they heard around them. Some sounds proved useful and were repeated more often. Others disappeared completely. Over thousands of years, these repeated sounds may have slowly become more consistent, carrying the same meaning every time people used them. Without anyone planning it, the first building blocks of language had begun to appear. But making sounds is only part of the story. Many animals can produce dozens of different calls, yet none of them have developed anything close to human language. What makes us different isn't simply that we can make sounds, it's what our brains can do with them. At some point during human evolution, our ancestors developed the ability to connect sounds with ideas in increasingly complex ways. Instead of every sound representing an emotion, sounds could begin representing objects, actions, places, and eventually even things that weren't physically present. Now you no longer needed to point at a river to communicate about it. You could simply make the agreed sound for river. For the first time, humans could discuss things they couldn't actually see. That may sound like a small change. In reality, it changed almost everything. Because once sounds represented ideas instead of immediate emotions, entirely new possibilities appeared. You could plan tomorrow's hunt instead of only reacting to today's. You could explain where dangerous animals usually slept. You could teach children how to shape a stone tool without demonstrating every single movement. Knowledge no longer had to disappear with the person who discovered it. It could be passed on, generation after generation. And that simple ability may have become one of the greatest advantages our species ever developed. But something else was happening at the same time. Every new generation wasn't simply copying language. They were improving it. Anyone who has spent time around young children knows they are extraordinary learners. A child can absorb thousands of words without ever sitting in a classroom. More importantly, children don't just imitate language. They recognize patterns within it. Many linguists believe this may have played a huge role in the evolution of speech. As children grew up listening to the sounds used by the adults around them, they naturally made those sounds more regular, more organized, and easier to understand. Tiny changes, repeated over hundreds or thousands of generations, slowly transformed simple vocal calls into increasingly complex languages. No one ever announced new rules. The rules simply emerged because they made communication easier. Think about how language works today. If I say, "the mammoth is near the river," Every word carries meaning, but so does the order of the words. If I mix them randomly, the message becomes confusing. That ability to arrange sounds into meaningful patterns is what separates human language from every known form of animal communication. Animals can certainly communicate. Some can even learn hundreds of symbols or gestures, but none appear able to create an endless number of completely new ideas by combining a limited number of sounds the way humans do. With only a few dozen different speech sounds, humans can create millions of unique words and an unlimited number of sentences. That ability changed everything. Imagine trying to organize a hunt without language. You could point toward an animal. You could wave your arms. You could make warning sounds, but explaining a plan would be incredibly difficult. How do you tell one group to wait behind the trees while another circles around from the left? How do you explain that the herd usually crosses the river tomorrow morning because that's where they drank yesterday? Without language, those ideas stay trapped inside your own mind. With language, they become shared knowledge. Suddenly, groups could cooperate in ways that had never been possible before. Knowledge no longer disappeared when someone died. Parents could teach children. Experienced hunters could explain their mistakes. Toolmakers could pass on techniques that had taken decades to master. One generation no longer had to start from the beginning. Each generation could build on the one before it. That single change may have accelerated human progress more than almost anything else. Language also allowed humans to talk about things that didn't physically exist. You could describe tomorrow. You could discuss yesterday. You could imagine places you had never visited. You could invent stories. You could create myths. You could explain invisible ideas like friendship, trust, promises, or belief. In a sense, language allowed humans to build entire worlds inside one another's minds, and perhaps that's the real miracle. We often think of language as something we use to speak, but language is actually something we use to share thoughts. Without it, every human mind would remain largely isolated. With it, millions of people can cooperate toward the same goal, even if they've never met. So when did the first true language appear? The honest answer is, nobody knows. There was probably never a moment when humans suddenly went from having no language to having one. Instead, imagine watching a sunrise. Can you point to the exact second that night becomes day? Not really. The darkness fades so gradually that the transition is almost impossible to notice. Language probably evolved in exactly the same way. Each generation communicated just a little more effectively than the one before it. The changes were tiny, almost invisible. But after tens of thousands of years, those tiny improvements became the thousands of languages spoken across our planet today. And those languages continue to change. In fact, you're witnessing it right now. The words you use every day didn't exist forever. New words appear, old words disappear, pronunciations shift, meanings change. The English spoken 500 years ago already sounds strange to us. Go back 1,000 years, and it becomes almost impossible to understand. Language has never stopped evolving. It is still changing every single day, which means the story of human language isn't something that ended in prehistory. You're part of it. Every conversation you have, every new phrase that spreads across the internet, every child learning their first words, every generation changing the way people speak. They're all continuing a process that began long before recorded history. Somewhere, hundreds of thousands of years ago, one ancient human made a sound. Another understood. They repeated it. Their children repeated it too. Generation after generation, those simple sounds slowly became conversations, stories, songs, books, science, and every idea that has ever been passed from one human mind to another. So when people ask how ancient humans learned to talk, the answer isn't that someone invented language. It's that countless ordinary people over thousands of generations slowly built it together. And every word you've read or spoken today is still carrying that story forward.